Let's talk plywood. It's very fitting that I'm sitting in front of this painting of trees because plywood is made from trees. Some say the origins of the use of plywood date back to ancient Egypt, where thin layers of wood were found glued together to make various pieces of furniture. Others trace its origins to ancient China about 1,000 years ago, where shaved wood was adhered with different types of animal resins and glue, and again used for furniture. It's interesting that all the historical uses largely of plywood and veneers were used for furniture, cabinetry, doors, things like that. Early forms of plywood that more closely resemble our modern-day plywood date back to 17th century England, 18th century France, and 19th century Russia, where again it was used largely in cabinetry and doors and furniture. The first modern patent of plywood dates to 1865 in New York City. A dude named John K. Mayo was the first to register the patent for modern plywood, though it's unclear if he actually took his manufacturing techniques of plywood to market. The first use of marketed plywood was in the 1905 Portland World Fair, which was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The fair marketed this 3-ply veneer plywood, which gained almost instant interest from door, cabinet, and trunk manufacturers. Plywood is generally considered the first of the engineered wood products, and today we use engineered wood products in everything that we build. So how is plywood made? Well, starts at the basics. You cut down a ton of trees. Now, plywood requires a certain dimension of tree, a certain diameter of tree, and a certain type of tree. Generally, Douglas fir from the Pacific Northwest or southern pine from the southern U.S. The logs are then cut into smaller sizes so they can be shipped. They are then debarked with this rolling machine of death, it looks like. And then the logs are put into a giant lathe, essentially, that shaves the thin layers of veneer off of the logs as the logs turn through this knife shape. And I absolutely love in these older videos that show almost no PPE being used and people seemingly working in dress clothes. It's just fantastic. The veneers are shaved off the logs. They're sorted and stacked. They're then cut to rough shape and then laid in position. Layers of this wood veneer are then applied with a waterproof adhesive, and that's a big part of the advancement in the development of plywood is the adhesive. So original plywood used caissons to adhere the layers of wood together, and then as we developed better, aka more toxic adhesives, we were able to make waterproof adhesives so that plywood could be used outside, marine applications, things like that. So then the layers of veneer are sandwiched between layers of adhesive in alternating directions of that grain pattern, and then put under a giant hydraulic press to press it all together and cure them. So following the 1905 World Fair in Portland, mass production started. By 1907, the plant that was marketing this 3-ply veneer was producing 400 panels a day. We'll keep track of the production. It's very interesting. Plywood sales were originally focused on one market, door panels. However, in 1920, a company in Seattle that was competing, it was called Elliott Bay Plywood, began marketing their plywood materials directly to the automobile industry. By 1929, they were recording about 358 million square feet of plywood produced annually. After the Great Depression, the use of plywood just absolutely skyrocketed. By 1944, there was over 30 mills in North America that were producing over 1.4 billion square feet annually. And only 10 years later, in 1954, there was over 100 mills and they were producing a total of 4 billion square feet of plywood annually. The plywood industry generally remained a Pacific Northwest phenomenon, and mills were located, like I said, throughout Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, where a lot of the source Douglas fir came from. However, in order to reduce the price of it and increase competition, in the 1960s, a lot of research and development went into the use of other woods, namely southern pine, which led to the creation of the Georgia-Pacific Corporation. Now, 2/3 of the U.S. plywood industry is produced in the South rather than the Pacific Northwest. After World War II, this huge boom in population, this huge boom in construction made plywood this largely construction material. But sort of around the same time, starting in the 1930s, designers started using it back to its original use of furniture. A Finnish designer Alvar Aalto created what is now known as the first bent plywood furniture. He used this to create this curved wood, and this technique was then popularized in the 1940s by couple Charles and Ray Eames. They were said to have been contracted by the US Navy to create light wood plywood parts for aircraft, as well as leg splints and other prototype materials. They developed what they called the Kazam machine to mold the plywood to their will, which led me down my conspiracy rabbit hole. Were they DARPA? The Eames lounge chair is probably their most famous piece, and I want one so bad. It entered the market in 1956, and it was made from exotic Brazilian rosewood plywood that they had specially made for this lounge chair. They originally retailed in 1956 for $350 for the lounger and the ottoman. Those original versions of the chair now sell upwards of $10,000 to $15,000 depending on their quality and provenance. The use of bent plywood became increasingly popular with other designers like Eero Saarinen and entered the modern day lexicon thanks to IKEA, because who hasn't sat in a Pohang chair and thoroughly enjoyed themselves? The use of plywood in our modern day has now been eclipsed by OSB, which is known as orientated strand board. OSB has captured more than 64% of the plywood market in the US alone. OSB is essentially the cheaper cousin to plywood. So OSB is made from these strands or shards of shredded wood laid in a cross-layered direction with adhesives, and then it's compressed under heat and pressure to create the uniform panel. OSB is sort of similar to the original descriptions of ancient materials found in ancient China and ancient Egypt thousands of years ago. It's the whole notion of what is old is new again. I'll make another video about the history of wood because I think it's really fascinating, especially looking at the last 100 years of wood. Spoiler alert, modern materials are generally worse. First modern production of OSB didn't start until the late 1970s and wasn't patented until 1978. But the real kicker obviously comes down to price. OSB is at least 15 to 30% cheaper than low-grade plywood, making it now super common for sheeting and structural panels. It's why it's really eclipsed plywood as the material of choice in construction these days. Okay, let's talk dollars, because at the end of the day, it's all about those Benjamins. A contractor recently told me about the cost increase of plywood, which led me to make this video. So the US Bureau of Labor Statistics Producer Price Index, PPI, measures wholesale prices of plywood, and they use the base year of 1982, and that base year they put a number to it of 100, so remember that. Without a doubt, the largest surge in price came after 2020 when something really crazy happened in the world. 2021, it surged to a record 702.5 in June of 2021. I remember that time very well in the construction industry. So it stabilized in 2021, 2022 to about 300. Again, remember our baseline is 100. This price further stabilized in 2025 to around 275 to 300. So the price volatility of plywood is a huge problem for the construction industry, obviously. A lot of industry sources note that wildfires are a huge constraint to supply and therefore cost in the market. Also, there's a lot of tariff volatility right now, which causes fluctuation in market costs. A significant amount of softwood lumber still comes from Canada, into the US, where the majority of plywood is actually made. So tariffs have a huge part to play in this all. Some reports say it's increasing by about 40% since the end of 2025. This, in my opinion, is certainly a driver to general inflated costs of construction. As I've often say here and other places, we are generally building at high costs with generally worse quality materials, which is going to cause a whole litany of problems in the future, but we'll talk about that in other videos surely. Price volatility ends up in your pocket as a consumer, whether you're buying a house, building a house, living in a house, living in an economy. Construction is a huge driver of economic strength. So thank you so much for watching. We will talk about more materials that build the world around us in future videos. Make sure you like, subscribe, and follow along as I talk more about this. And thanks so much for watching.